Welcome. Welcome, Rotarians and guests, to the Rotary Club of Seattle, the fourth oldest and one of the world's largest Rotary clubs, where we embrace service above self and are connecting for good. The centerpiece of today's program is our environment and its future. Like many of us, I often take for granted that the air I breathe and the water I drink will be clean and plentiful. But I've come to appreciate that that is not a given. Since the drafting of the Paris Climate Change Accord last December, I've begun to wonder, what more can we do to promote a clean environment? As I read about the initiatives that are underway and some of the things being considered for our state, I wanted to learn more. So that's the genesis of today's program. I want to thank our Sustainability Committee, ably led by co-chairs Eric Christensen. Eric, I want to see you raise your hand, and Stan Gent, for tackling this challenge to put together a program on a massive topic on the environment. We're going to hear today from two of the most qualified local experts to give us a status on our current environment, and then we're going to hear from a three-person panel that will share with us three different directions that we could take in our state. So I look forward to that. But to get us started, we have a climate-themed inspiration from Corinne Cavanaugh. Come on up, Corinne. Followed by our song leader, Lou Lundquist, who happens to be celebrating his 27th year of membership in our club, and he's going to be accompanied on the piano by Freeman Fong. Corinne.
Thank you, Kathy. This is an exciting program, and I was reflecting on it, and I wanted to share with you that I was a latchkey kid, and I watched a lot of TV, and I can still remember the jingle from the TV commercial, "Don't leave the water running." Does anybody remember this? What stuck with me, and it showed you to turn off the water while brushing your teeth. These days in Seattle, we don't use plastic grocery bags, and we have a trash and a recycle and a compost. Meanwhile, abroad, not long ago, I witnessed someone burning garbage in a metal trash can. When you see and hear these types of things, it makes you question, aren't we here in Washington State doing enough? Shouldn't environmental sustainability be the responsibility of others? Today, I want to impart this thought. The greatest gift, the greatest service above self, and the greatest legacy we can give to our kids and grandkids is to leave this planet a better place than we found it. Each of us individually are responsible for the planet, both through our daily acts like brushing our teeth with the water off, but also through our vote.
To moderate all the information we're going to get, I'm delighted to welcome KCTS's Enrique Serna. Enrique, will you come up? Enrique was born and raised in Yakima, and he joined KCTS 9 in January of 1995. He's anchored current affairs programs, moderated statewide political debates, produced and reported stories for public television, in addition to local documentaries on social and juvenile justice, the environment, Latinos, a wide range of subjects. Enrique has earned 9 Northwest Emmy Awards and numerous other honors. And then in June of 2013, he was inducted into the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences Northwest Chapter, the Silver Circle, for his work as a TV professional. So we are indeed very fortunate to have Enrique moderating our program today, and I'm going to turn it over to him. Thank you, Enrique.
Thank you. Boy, I feel tall here. I'm going to move this just a second. I usually like to be that tall, but anyway, it's a little distracting. Well, thank you very much for allowing me to be here with you today to be your MC moderator for our conversation, which I think is very important. Today's program is brought to you from your Sustainability Committee, whose goals are educating ourselves, Rotary colleagues, and the public about how and why we should all conserve energy and resources and adopt sustainable solutions, demonstrating the benefits to ourselves and future generations of a sustainable approach to business and living, innovating with ideas promoted by Rotary clubs to switch to sustainable practices in all Rotary projects, donating to a Rotary Club project that offsets our unavoidable personal carbon emissions, advocating to our Rotary Club the importance of sustainability as the world wrestles with carbon emission reductions and other resource constraints. So much is changing in the field of planet warming, both politically and scientifically. And from the recent Paris Accord to the Governor's Clean Air Plan and Initiative 732, the Carbon Washington ballot measure, we're being drawn into this conversation. We're being asked to vote on this in one way or another in November. So today we offer an appreciation of these changes and what they are likely to mean in both the short and longer term. So from the Paris Accord to the Puget Sound, it's our discussion today, and we have with us two of the most qualified local experts to bring us into the current information. So let me bring them up here. Brenna Davis and Joe Casola, come on up. And as they do, I'm going to do a short introduction of both of them. Brenna is co-founder and chair of Washington Business for Climate Action, a sustainability expert with nearly 2 decades of experience. She leads Virginia Mason Health System sustainability efforts, and under her leadership, Virginia Mason has been named one of the 25 most sustainable hospitals in the United States by Practice Green Health. Joe Casola is the Deputy Director at the University of Washington's Climate Impacts Group. He's worked on issues related to climate science and policy for more than 15 years. His career is focused on translating information about climate variability, climate change, and climate impacts for policymakers, resource managers, and business leaders. Please welcome them. Well, we're going to have a little conversation here about these issues. Brenna, you were in Paris when the 197 countries agreed to actions to limit global temperatures increase to well below 2 degrees Celsius. So what were your impressions of what happened there and what was accomplished, if anything?
Thank you, Enrique. First of all, let me say it's such a pleasure to be here on the stage with you. I'm a huge fan of your work, so thank you. And thank you to the Rotary for covering this topic. It's really timely. In Paris, it was sort of the world leaders had been meeting for about 20 years to try to reach some type of agreement on climate change. After the 21st year in Paris, they agreed to a historic agreement that covers 90% of all emissions globally. And the goal of the agreement was to stay below 2 degrees Celsius on the planet, and also there was a stretch goal of 1.5 degrees. In that agreement also, you know, the 1.5 degrees sort of emerged in Paris as a really interesting issue. My colleagues in the Philippines from Healthcare Without Harm let me know that 2 degrees of warming was actually detrimental to the Philippines, and that as an island nation, they were advocating for 1.5 degrees. So that became a big trend there in Paris. And the idea is that if we stay below 2 degrees of warming, we're going to avoid the most catastrophic impacts of climate change, which include really severe storms. You'll talk about this, but really severe storms, drought, and continued conflict in certain regions of the world. And I think, you know, out of the Paris Agreement, we got commitments from countries to stay below about 3 degrees Celsius. So we haven't actually gotten to the 2 degrees, the commitments we need to stay below 2 degrees, but they're going to continue to ratchet down, and every 5 years they'll be reviewing that. So let me just say that in the last couple days, it was actually ratified by enough countries to make it final. There are no legal binding agreements of the Paris Climate Agreement. Like there's no
But you got to
specific,
do it.
Yeah, they got to do it. No, they don't have to do it, but it's the biggest agreement we've ever done. It's the farthest we've ever come, and there's still a lot more to do.
Well, Joe, your organization has done a lot of research connecting climate change to water here in the Pacific Northwest. Of course, water is so important, not just here, but all around the world. So talk a bit about the importance there.
Sure. Let's see. Oh,
He's
great.
got some maps.
So I've got some pictures.
We got
to
visuals.
Show. Water is obviously connected to a lot of important resources in the Northwest. In the city of Seattle, 90% of our electricity comes from hydropower. Our drinking water is obviously climate sensitive. The food that we eat is often irrigated from water that is somewhere falling in the region. Salmon that a lot of us really think of as iconic and in some ways sacred depend on the water that's there. And a lot of the other ecosystems that we care about are all very, very sensitive to having a water supply that's clean and at the right temperature and coming at the right time. So what about climate change? So these pictures show where the snow is normally, and you can see the spine of the Cascades in that upper left photo. You can also see the Olympics, a little kind of dot west of us, and you can see some of the headwater areas of the Columbia River Basin in eastern Washington. What happens in the future is as things get warmer, we push the snow line up in a lot of these mountains. And we know this from experience. If you look back at warm years like 2005 or 2015, you had very, very little snow or snow levels that were very, very high. And when this happens, that means the amount of snow that we have left over at the end of the rainy season that then can feed our streams, that can make its way to the Sound, that can go over the dams and be used to produce electricity, that water isn't there. It's already run off earlier on. And these changes, you may not be able to read the numbers, but in the bottom, these are different projections for different times in the coming decades. And you can see even in the next few decades out, we're looking at maybe a 20 or 30% reduction in the amount of water that we would have at the end of the rainy season stored naturally in the snowpack. If you go farther out in the century, those numbers become more in the 50 and 60% range. So a really significant change in what that looks like in the mountains, that natural storage that would really be unaffordable to us to try to rebuild or find another way to get. And I'll quickly kind of walk through what that looks like in rivers. And this is a hydrograph for the Yakima River. You can see a little peak in the winter when the rain starts to pick up, then it dips down as that rain shifts over to snow, and then a much bigger peak in the spring and the summer as that water melts. When we step forward into the future, as we have that changeover, the snow lines moving up, we expect more of that precip in the wintertime to come down as rain. We're going to shift that peak earlier in the season, and then that low flow period gets longer and even lower. And so when we think about what the future projections might look like, we take a system that usually had these two peaks with a very, very large peak during a dry time of year, during the kind of spring and summer. And we shift to what looks like a watershed like the Chehalis, a watershed with no mountains. So the blue, yellow, and red show for future periods, and the blue looks a little bit like the historical in black, but when you get to the red, kind of the end of the 21st century, you really just have a peak of rainfall, and you have very little snow kind of contributing to the flow. So again, if you're in agriculture, if you're a grower out in the Yakima watershed, if you're someone who likes to go salmon fishing out there, this can be a very big deal. And our group tries to be very careful not to be too much of a Debbie Downer when we spread some of this news, but it's a matter of preparation. You know, we have a lot of scientific knowledge at our hands that we can put towards our resource management to find new ways to work around some of this which is are coming our way.
Well, let me ask you this. Are we doing enough with all of that knowledge?
That's a great question. I think that we're off to a good start. But there's a lot of issues that we have yet to come up with, I think, a permanent solution to, water being one of them. You know, we have a lot of different agencies that manage water, how they work together, how we deal with water rights. These are not new issues, and these are not easy issues. So I think there's certainly more to do. I think the other thing with climate change is that it's not going to be a set of decisions that we make once and then we're done. It's going to be an ongoing management and a bit of monitoring, a bit of experimentation, and some kind of agile thinking that we can do in the future that our infrastructure and our operations for a lot of important systems have to be a little bit more nimble.
Brenna, I want you to weigh in on that from a business perspective. Also, I mean, you work in the healthcare industry, but why should business care so much?
Yeah, well, we know that there are tremendous business risks associated with climate change. Just in our state alone, we know that there's risk to processed water. We know that Starbucks is worried about their supply chain associated, with the coffee beans and the growing of coffee beans. We know that aquaculture is being impacted and will be impacted because of ocean acidification or Puget Sound acidification. The list goes on and on. So it's really important to start planning now. Where's your facility located? Is it going to be inundated when sea level rises? Are you preparing for high heat days? Like we did at Virginia Mason, we did an evaluation of our resilience. And we noticed that we weren't sizing our HVAC systems properly for future heat. So we're trying to work on incorporating that. The other thing that's important to say is, yeah, this stuff is really dire and it's really can be really scary, but also it's a great opportunity. If you're a business person, it's a good opportunity to get into the clean technology field, because we're going to have to start leapfrogging over some of these fossil fuel technologies that right now are pretty much antiquated. We're not going to be able to continue using fossil fuels at the same speed as we are now. So how can we use this to our business advantage and start planning for those HVAC systems, start planning for the infrastructure we'll need, start planning these new technologies and investing in research and development?
So Paris is really, when you look at the Accords, it's kind of this helicopter part of what's happening in the world. But how do you bring that down to talk about how it then affects our region, our businesses, ourselves locally?
Well, for us at Virginia Mason, like I said, we're starting to try to plan ahead. We've taken images of the high heat. We know that we're going to have as many high heat days as Dallas, Texas by 2050 in Seattle. So we've taken the images and the heat maps from our region. We've mapped that over our patient diagnosis codes to see how it will impact our patients, and we're starting to try to figure out how to implement that. We've also reduced our greenhouse gas emissions locally. We're working on that. We've pledged to reduce them by 30% by 2030. On a national level, we're advocating for a climate policy. And in Washington State, we founded Washington Business for Climate Action, which is a group of 260 businesses that are calling for action on climate change and trying to find some middle-of-the-road policy that will work for business.
So, Joe, I'm kind of wondering, how's our winter look like here? What does it mean for us? I mean, because we often tend to judge it by the snowpack we have, but it also has an impact on what it means in the summertime, because we've had forest fires here that have been very, very damaging to places in central and eastern Washington.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it's funny. If you ask people about the 2014, 2015 year where we were really warm, we had the big forest fires, there wasn't much of a ski season, a lot of people in Seattle might have said, oh, actually it was really pleasant. It was nice, it was balmy, it didn't rain that much. And
got a lot of pool time, right?
Yeah, I heard that.
I have sympathy for that, but the reality is our kind of normal, kind of somewhat gray, somewhat chilly climate is what's good for that snow in the mountains, which then has a lot of other benefits kind of farther down later in the course of the year. So yeah, we're looking at a future with certainly with less snowpack. Another big change, and this water story that I'm telling is not the only story in town, but another big issue I think for our winters is when we get heavier rainfall, we'll likely have more rainfall. And that is a big deal, I think, for Western Washington in particular, because a lot of the places where we live are flood prone. They are either along the Sound or they're along rivers, and the idea of having heavy rainfall events has a lot of implications for homes and businesses, and also for the stormwater challenges that we have kind of in the present day. So I think between the loss of snowpack and those heavier rainfall events and the subsequent flooding, I think those are two pretty big things. But one of the things that Brenna mentioned was opportunities, and I think that's also important to think about. Most of the time, if those of you who might run electricity-intensive businesses, I'm going to guess your energy costs are much higher in the winter for heating. That's going to go down. You're not going to have to spend as much for heating in the winter. That may be a way to have some benefit or to find ways to create savings there. Now, you may have more cooling demand in the summer that you haven't had previously. Another type of kind of possible benefit, not just in the winter, but agriculturally, there's having a longer growing season is not always a bad thing if you can get enough water. One of the types of crops that might do well here or may continue to do well here is wine grapes. There are a lot of areas that are marginal right now that would likely be beneficial, or the ones that are doing okay now can do well in the future, whereas some of our neighbors in California may have more challenges. So again, it's about, I think, can we get appropriate information to anticipate some of these changes as opposed to it's all bad. But I definitely think that the winters of the future will not look like the winters of the past in the Northwest.
Yeah, and just to build on that, one thing we haven't talked about is sort of environmental security. So when you look at these forest fires that we had Apple storage facilities in the center of Yakima burning down, in the center of a town. We think that it impacts folks. And internationally, we just had 900,000 legal people emigrating from Syria to Greece. And that situation was exacerbated by weather. And we've seen it throughout history. The Irish potato famine, the French Revolution, they were all impacted by weather. So what does that mean for our future? What does that mean for the future of the Pacific Northwest in terms of folks migrating here? So it's something to think about in terms of international security. And when I was at the White House recently, I spoke with someone there, and she told me they're very concerned about national security and international security related to these weather and climate events.
Very quickly, we have such tremendous growth going on here in the Puget Sound region. So when we consider these issues, how does that come into play? Very quickly.
So I think a big deal is, and this is one of these kind of are we doing enough areas, how do we think about our future land use? And there's lots of components of that, obviously transportation, jobs, housing, things like that, which are not related to the climate directly. But I think we have to weave some climate thinking into that. And when I say that, I mean, are we developing in places that are at high flood risk? Are we developing in places that might be in an urban heat island? Are we developing in places where we're thinking about the future stormwater flows? So I think from our perspective, the growth we consider to be relatively inevitable, crossing our fingers that all the economic kind of growth continues to drive people coming here, but to find ways to ask that climate question as part of the development that occurs.
Brenna and Joe, let's give them a round of applause. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. They're going to be joining us a little bit later for more conversation. But as we transition here, we're going to be talking now a bit about Initiative 732, the carbon tax measure that's going to be before voters in November. I'd like to have my next group of panelists come on up, find their seats, and as they do, I will introduce them. Chris Davis, raise your hand, Chris, so they know who you are. There you go. Chris joined Governor Inslee's administration in 2014 as the Senior Advisor for Energy and Carbon Markets. His portfolio includes clean energy, greenhouse gas emissions reduction, and the use of market-based mechanisms to reduce carbon pollution. Yoram Bauman is the founder and co-chair of Carbon Washington, yes, on 732. He has a PhD in economics from the University of Washington, and he makes a living as the world's first and only stand-up economist. Yeah, he's very funny with numbers. Okay. Sarah Severn heads up Sarah Severn Consulting. She advises businesses engaged in climate change policy, and she is currently on the board of the American Sustainable Business Council and Forum for the Future. She is also a strategic advisor to Washington Business for Climate Action. She's been there since September 2014. Give them a round of applause, please. They each are going to have 5 minutes to give us a short presentation on where they are on the initiative, and we'll begin with Chris.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here. I appreciate the chance to talk with you a little bit about what's underway. Don't need it, thank you. With the governor's actions around these issues. I'm going to pick up quickly on two things that Joe and Brenna spoke about. On the one hand, I'm sort of accustomed to being in front of groups like yours where I have to follow talks like Joe's, which on the one hand can be a little bit debilitating when you look at those maps, unless you're an enophile, and then you might be a little excited about the prospects for the future. So on the one hand, there's that side, and then on the other hand, you heard Brenna talk about the Paris aspirations for 2 degree, to limit our global warming to 2 degrees or potentially 1.5 degrees over the next several years. And the thing that I want to share and add on to what Brenna said is that Joe's work and the work of a lot of his colleagues is based on models, and models are often built on sort of taking what we call a baseline or a business as usual scenario for how we're doing emissions now, looking at that in the future, and then asking ourselves what's it going to take to go from that to the kind of reduced emissions that are necessary to meet those targets. And what those models are telling us right now is that we have a little bit of time. Getting from the trajectory that we're on right now to the one that Brenna described does involve a point in time when we go so far as that it's not going to be possible to hit those numbers, but we're not there yet. It may not be very far out from right now. It might be 8, 10, 15 years, depending on which of Joe's models you look at. But we are still working in a moment when we have an opportunity to reverse the course, or at least amend the course that we're on right now. And it's that sort of perspective that the governor took to Paris last year. He was part of a range of what we call subnational leaders around the world who participated in the Paris conference. I'm happy to say that in addition to the international momentum that Brenna referenced that's bringing the Paris Agreement into action just this week, there's been great activity across that subnational realm globally. Just in North America, we have provinces in Canada adding their own programs. We have California and Oregon extending and expanding their commitments to renewables in the last couple of years. And we have Governor Inslee here in Washington just about 2 weeks ago taking action by completing his clean air rule, which I'll spend the remainder of my time giving you a quick overview on. So 50 pages of regulatory text or so in 2 minutes. Here we go. The governor's clean air rule is one of a number of initiatives he's taken since taking office that are designed to accelerate and propel our clean energy economy, and at the same time to reduce our emissions. So it is effectively a CAP program. It looks at the largest sources of emissions in our state. If you emit more than 100,000 tons a year, you are part of this program. What that means is typically you are what we call a stationary source, a big factory that reduces greenhouse gas emissions, or you are a manufacturer of automotive fuels. Washington State's a little bit unusual relative to the rest of the country, where most emissions come from our power sector. Here in Washington, they mostly come from all of us driving our cars. And then the third is if you are a distributor of natural gas, which is a big part of both our electrical system and how we heat our homes. If you are within those three categories and you emit more than 100,000 tons, we're going to ask you to reduce those over time. The reduction rate is about 5% every 3 years. And as long as you comply with that over time, the state will bring down its emissions down to a level that puts us on a path to meet actual targets we have in statute from the legislature. In order to help you do that, we provide a lot of different opportunities. It's a very flexible rule. On the one hand, you might change your industrial processes or add energy efficiency techniques to reduce your emissions. You might opt to go to someone else who's more cost-effective at that than you are and buy credits from their activities, which you then turn and submit to the state. So the emissions come down, but you achieve those reductions more cost-effectively by purchasing them from someone else. Or you may go to another state in the country where we've identified people have similar programs like ours, and you may buy credits or allowances in those programs and bring them to us. The idea here is to be flexible, to recognize that Washington wants to grow, we want to expand our economy, we don't want this to cramp that, but at the same time, we want incentives that cause us to be more efficient over time. Our timeline for this is, as I mentioned, the rule was formalized just about a week and a half ago. After about a year and a half of hard work and stakeholder outreach, it goes into effect January 1st of 2017 coming up, and folks will have their first opportunity to come and tell us how they're doing in 2019, so they'll have 3 years to come and demonstrate compliance with that.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. All right, let's move on to Sarah Severin. Sarah.
Oh, okay. So it would be better actually if Yoram goes first. Because,
Okay,
yeah.
well, you're very nice to let him do that. All right, let's go with Yoram.
Great. I'm here representing the Initiative 732 campaign. I represent hundreds of people who gathered signatures last year, 360,000 signatures to qualify Initiative 732 for the ballot. So those of you who vote in Washington State will have an opportunity to vote on this in the weeks ahead. Over 1,000 people who have donated money to the campaign. And our grassroots effort has really been motivated by three things. One of those primarily is that we feel a moral obligation to take action on climate change for the sake of those of us who are around today, as well as for our children and grandchildren. We do that with a carbon tax, a price on fossil fuels, price on carbon emissions, that's going to be one of the strongest climate policies in the world. We also feel an economic obligation to do that in a way that makes sense for households and businesses across the state. And we do that by using the revenue from the carbon tax to reduce existing taxes, primarily the state sales tax. But we also reduce some business taxes for manufacturers, and we fund an earned income tax credit benefit for low-income households. Finally, we feel a political obligation to take action on climate change in a way that makes sense to folks across the political spectrum. We are delighted to have, in addition to a number of endorsements from Democrats, we're delighted to have endorsements from 3 Republican state senators, and we take very seriously this obligation of taking action in a bipartisan fashion. The motivation for our campaign is the best climate policy in the world, which is just to our north in the Canadian province of British Columbia, which in 2008 had a right of center government that said, look, we want to do something about climate change, but we want to be market friendly, we don't want to grow government. So they implemented exactly this kind of policy, a revenue neutral carbon tax. So yes, they pay more for fossil fuels, but all the revenues go to reduce personal and corporate income taxes in the province of British Columbia. The policy's been in effect for 8 years now. It has successfully reduced carbon emissions. The economy of British Columbia is doing fine, and a vast majority of the voters in British Columbia, as well as both major political parties, now support their carbon tax policy. So that was the inspiration for Initiative 732. This slide didn't seem to come in all the way. So the basic idea here is very similar. There's a carbon tax on fossil fuels, phases into $25 per ton of CO2, and then goes up slowly over time. To put that in context, $25 per ton of CO2 is about 25 cents a gallon of gasoline. It's about 2.5 cents a kilowatt hour of coal-fired power, about half that for natural gas, nothing for wind, solar, hydro, renewables. So it provides this financial incentive for individuals, households, businesses, utilities to move their operations in a more sustainable direction. The vast majority of the money from the carbon tax, as you can see from this slide, goes to reduce the state sales tax by a full percentage point. May or may not sound like all that much, but nickels and dimes add up over the course of the year. This is going to mean a savings of hundreds of dollars a year for an average household in Washington state. If you want to see how it will work out for your household or business, the University of Washington Computer Science Department has a carbon tax swap calculator where you can enter in your own data and see how it will affect your family. But most households end up plus or minus $100, maybe $200, and that's the goal. Not to make government bigger, not to make government smaller, but to make the tax system smarter, fairer, and more sustainable. For businesses, as I mentioned, we reduced the business tax, the B&O tax for manufacturing in the state of Washington to enable businesses to remain competitive when they're competing with other businesses outside of the state. And then we fund a 25% match of the federal earned income tax credit, one of the most successful anti-poverty programs in the United States. This policy is going to provide up to $1,500 a year for 460,000 working families in Washington state. And between that and the reduction in the sales tax, our policy is going to be the most progressive step forward in terms of the tax system in Washington state in 40 years.
I need to jump in on you time-wise here and move
Let
on.
me just.
All right? Okay. We need to go to
We
Sarah.
are great.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm sure we can come back to that. So I'm here representing Washington Business for Climate Action that Brenna mentioned. She's the chair. We are a network of companies, over 260, who came together 2 years ago around something called the Climate Declaration, saying that we need to take action on the policy front to tackle climate change in our state. We represent a whole range of different business sectors: outdoor industry, building services and construction, fisheries, farming, marine and freight services, and so on. And I think the most important concepts that I want to get across are, first, we have a set of policy principles, and the first of those is that we believe the science that's behind those agreements in Paris, the science that is being espoused by experts like Jim Hansen. And we support science-based limits. And that means we support the goals that have been set here in the state, although we don't think they're strong enough. The second is we are supporting the establishment of a carbon pricing mechanism, which is what Yoram has been talking about. But where we differ, there's a departure from 732, is that we believe in a revenue positive approach. In other words, instead of putting the money back in the form of a sales tax rebate, we believe some of that money needs to be invested in solutions. And we have done some modeling recently to show that a price on carbon in itself is just not sufficient to get us to meet those targets or even exceed them, which is where we'd preferably like to be, to hit that 1.5 degrees that Brenna talked about. And that actually, if you take some of the money that you get from putting a price on carbon and reinvest it in solution sets like energy efficiency and clean transportation, and innovation and R&D, you can actually bend the curve further and in a more cost-effective manner. You don't have to put the actual carbon price up as high as you would do with a price alone. So these are kind of tricky concepts, I know, to get across without visuals, and if I put the models up for you, I think everybody's eyes would glaze over. So I think, that's what we're looking for. And in addition to that, we think there's a real need to invest in the natural resource base of the state. You heard from Joe, you heard about the threat to forests, to our water infrastructure, our fisheries with ocean acidification, and nobody's yet mentioned our pollinators. I'm a beekeeper. And I know that they're going to be stressed by these changes because of changes in vegetation, in timings and cycles. So there's a need to put some revenues into that. And the other thing is that as we've worked on this approach, we've understood that it pretty much aligns with what Bill Gates has been recommending. And he, with his group, has actually said what we need is two things. We need a price on carbon, coupled with a big increase in government-led investment in R&D. And the reason he says it needs to be government-led is because R&D investment generally in energy has a very long tail to it. It's not something that a lot of the private sector wants to invest in. And it takes significant government funding. Now, he's talking about this at a federal and an international level, but there are opportunities here, we believe, in the state as well.
Okay, you wrapped up? Okay, you had about a minute left there. All right, I want to bring Brenna and Joe back up here, and we'll have a little bit more of a conversation. We'd like to open it up actually to the audience here for any questions and comments that you might have about the initiative or any of the other presentations that were made by Joe and Brenna. So we have a couple of people with mics, so please raise your hands so that we can, got one right here. Let's go.
Thank you for your presentations. With respect to the slides that you showed at the beginning of your presentation, you didn't state what the assumptions were for these changes. What degree of temperature change and what is the likelihood of the increase in the temperature changes that impact the snowpack?
Yeah, that's a good point, and I would point you to our report, Adapting to Change, to get more of the full disclosure. So for those pictures that show kind of the early part of the century, like up to the 2050s, those are where we think the hydrology goes regardless of a lot of our energy choices. We're kind of stuck with that. That's a lot from the carbon dioxide that's already in the atmosphere, and the fact that the energy systems that we have in place are unlikely to totally turn over in the next, let's say, 10 to 20 years, globally speaking. Where it becomes more of a what future are we looking at becomes a more important question when you look at the end of the century. And the stuff that I was showing was what we would consider a business as usual trajectory. So a lot of the things from Paris, assuming those things don't stick, those things don't get implemented. And that future is very warm. Globally, that's about 4 Celsius, so it's about 8 Fahrenheit. For Washington, it may be more like 10 Fahrenheit warmer than the past. So that is a pretty significantly different future, but that is the kind of business as usual one. As far as its likelihood, that is really up to the decisions of the next 10 to 15 years globally, kind of like Chris said earlier. Whether or not we stay on that business as usual pathway or whether we change is, even though it's a long-term pathway, the infrastructure that's going to get put in our energy systems globally those decisions are being made in the next decade to 2 decades.
Anna has a question.
Thank you so much. It's such important work you're doing. My question is regarding methane gas, particularly when we look at the production with the livestock, cattle in particular, and the emission of methane gas, and then of course the resources that's required in the livestock production, both water, land, forests. Can you speak to how that's factoring into this?
Is that directed at Joe or anybody in particular?
Anybody that's ready to answer it.
Sure, I can take a shot. So agriculture emissions in the United States, I don't know Washington specifically, but in the United States is I think in the neighborhood of about 10-ish% of our total emissions. So it gets swamped by the emissions for electricity and the emissions from cars, from transportation, from vehicles. That's not the case globally. If you look globally, especially in a lot of places in the developing world, where you have much less energy use, per unit GDP, agriculture is one of the biggest sources of emissions, and those emissions can come from a couple of areas. One can be the use of fertilizers that have nitrogen in them, and the other can be in the management of manure, or actually the raising of cattle, because they're sources of methane. So it really kind of depends where you are. I think, and Chris, maybe you can talk, I don't know if the agricultural emissions in Washington are part of any of the policies that you're talking about.
In Washington State, they're a little bit, from agriculture, they're a little bit lower than the numbers that Joe gave at the national level, more like 6 or 7%. The trick that maybe Joe didn't mention, for those of you, methane is infinitely more powerful a greenhouse gas than CO2. So while there may be far less methane going out into the system, its short-term impact on the warming function is far greater. So it's something we think about a lot. Some emissions are covered by the program that I referenced. A lot of what comes through the transmission system of natural gas, we lose gas at the compression stations, it leaks along the system. This is a concern that we're learning a lot more about in the last couple of years, as so much of our electricity system has shifted nationally from coal to natural gas, and we're transmitting so much more of that natural gas. The transmission system itself is now emerging as a problem. There's no doubt that compared to coal, natural gas is a huge part of the solution that we need in terms of short-term gains. There's also no doubt that natural gas methane still results in greenhouse gas emissions, and as we lock in those investments now as better alternatives to coal, we need to think about the consequences of those for 10 or 15 years down the line, when we want more renewables in the system, which are going to compete with that gas.
Hi, my question is for Yoram and Sarah. If the changes need to occur within the next 10 to 15 years, that seems like an incredibly short period of time that we have to make these changes. So there seems to be a little bit of debate going on about whether to support this initiative or not support it. And wouldn't it be better to just support something that's on the ballot now and going to happen now, so that you are able to make those changes quickly, rather than waiting until something happens later that's maybe a little bit more perfect?
Yes.
Yes, and so here's the thing: if 732 goes ahead as it's currently written, you know it's very difficult to change things through the legislative process. I think, and Chris can speak to this. Well, I don't know. If we could wave a magic wand and get all the things we want out of it as well, I'd say yes, that would be great. But in the end, businesses and individuals have to vote their conscience. And if you think going with the 732 is the right way to go right now, and you think you can make the fixes later, but there are other issues with 732 that have been raised by other communities, which I know are not necessarily being discussed here, but that's where some of the opposition is coming from.
Let me just briefly chime in and say that, I think many of our supporters would support any climate policy that's out there. If you care deeply about climate change, and pretty much everybody should care deeply about climate change, then you should support lots of climate policies that are out there. I think that what Sarah's referring to is, and we saw this in British Columbia also, because 732 is sort of a middle-of-the-road policy, we end up getting attacked by the folks on the far left as well as the folks on the far right. I'll make a football analogy out of this. It is the fourth quarter of the game, and we are losing, and Initiative 732 has slipped past the defense and is wide open in the center of the end zone. And there are folks who will not throw us the ball because they only want to throw the ball to the very far left side of the end zone. And we are in the center of the end zone. So you should decide for yourselves about Initiative 732. I will say that a surprising number of people tell us that they will personally vote for 732, even though their organizations are not taking a position on it.
Susan has a question over here.
I have a question for Brenna. We've talked a lot about the agriculture industry, but the work that you're doing from the perspective of the biomedical research and biotech industry, I think is also really important for us to understand, because we're all very proud of the research going on, especially in the greater Seattle area. So could you talk about how Virginia Mason now is leading so much of the international community, especially the research community in its work, and how this initiative would play out for you and other research institutions?
Sure, thank you so much. We're really proud of the Benaroya Research Institute that does a lot of work on immunological disorders. And we recently got a new grant on specifically working on asthma, which is really exciting for us. We know that our state has one of the highest rates of asthma, so we're happy to be contributing to solving that problem. Well, Virginia Mason on the international level, we've been working with Global Green Health, which is an organization that's advocating for action on climate change internationally in the healthcare industry. And last year we collaborated with 8 different organizations from 8 different countries to kick off the Global 2020 Challenge, which is a challenge in healthcare itself from people all over the world, from Korea, from UK, from all over, working to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in their facility. So we're a part of that. And then recently there's been an emergence in China. Now that they've signed the new climate agreement, they're working really hard at reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, including potentially surpassing us with their R&D and technological research, I will add, hope they don't. But they're also looking at global green and sustainable hospitals. So just 2 weeks ago, the Chinese government invited us to meet in a summit with Healthcare Without Harm to look at how could they emulate what's being done in the US to reduce their impact in their hospitals in China. So I had the pleasure of attending that. And what was funny or not funny, but fascinating about that conversation was that they said, oh, we love your ideas. We're going to take them back to China. We're going to implement them. We're going to test them and do a small pilot. And then they said, that pilot's going to be in 500 hospitals. Literally, they're building 500 green, sustainable hospitals. And when you think about healthcare in the US is 8% of greenhouse gas emissions, that's the size of the UK. You think about 500 hospitals being built that are sustainable, low carbon, and green, it's really exciting. So we're really proud to be a part of that discussion.
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting. For the gentleman from the state of Washington, as I was sitting here looking at the chart from The Economist, which is my background also, I looked up there and I thought, oh, here's an interesting situation. You want to raise some money to do something, and let's just say in the city of Seattle there's like 50 or 60,000 people that are single that live within 2 miles of their work, for a business that pays almost no business and occupation tax because almost all its revenues come outside the state, and there's no state income tax, which I don't want anyway, and I drive a hybrid, but they don't drive at all, and the only thing they do is spend money on sales tax. That's the only way you get any revenue out of those folks, and you're going to cut that. So what you're effectively doing is taking all the non-tech, all non-hipster people to the woodshed, and and letting them skate by again and again and again. It's like my favorite pet peeve. Why does the left not want to tax where the money is, right? Check the Forbes 400 list. You know, if you have a $56 billion net worth and your company has net losses over the last 20 years, they should be talking to them, not Donald. So please address the composition of where incomes come from and how they're taxed within our existing system and how that affects getting the money to do the things you want to do.
Did you want to direct that to me or to Yoram, whose tax is actually the one doing that?
I think that question, how does the state deal with the changed composition of where their revenues come from? Because that's a key part of that chart.
I think this gentleman is advocating for an income tax, which is probably harder than pushing on climate action. You know, what we did with Initiative 732 was we looked at the tax system the way it is now. In British Columbia, they have a carbon tax, they lower income taxes. Obviously, we can't do that in Washington State because we have no income tax. So we thought, how can we provide, what sort of taxes can we cut that's going to provide benefits to households and businesses across the state? And we came up with the sales tax. And if you use the UW carbon tax swap calculator, just about everybody ends up plus or minus $100, maybe $200. There's nobody who's being taken to the woodshed. There's nobody who's coming out of this like, you know, like Richie Rich. So go use the calculator and see the numbers for yourself.
Brian has a question over here.
You mentioned the reduction in snowpack and an increase in rainfall, but you didn't indicate whether the total amount of water falling would be the same, more or less. If the rainfall supplements the lack of snow, are there any schemes being thought of storage of water or seasonal variations, how we use water, that would allow us to make up for the loss of snow?
Yeah, that's a great point. So we don't expect the annual amount of precipitation to change very much. So what we do expect is that it's warmer when we get our winter precip, so we get less snow, and that the heavy rains get heavier, so that also means that there might be a spacing out of storms as well to kind of compensate. But the total amount that we might get in the future is very is well within the past variability between wet and dry years. We expect something like a couple percentage points increase, but we can have plus and minus 30% from year to year. So we don't expect there to be a big compensatory increase in rainfall that allows us to have, let's say, a dense high elevation snowpack that offsets the loss at lower elevations. That being said, the other part of your question, are people trying to come up with more storage? Absolutely. If you talk to folks on the eastern side of the Cascades, there's a lot of discussion of trying to do storage of various sizes. Everything from kind of the small scale off-stream storage to underground pumping to building multi-billion-dollar reservoirs. I think that those types of decisions open up their own set of environmental and fiscal issues, especially the bigger scale ones. So then it becomes a risk balancing activity. How much, let's say, drought risk or how much loss of water reliability are we willing to tolerate versus how much damage would we want to do to salmon populations, how much cost do we want to put up front for capital projects. So that's one that you know, we can outline from my group, some of the water reliability part of that, but those other parts of that decision get well beyond the climate science. But it is certainly one of the first things that I think people are trying to explore.
Can I just add to that? That's one of the reasons we're arguing for this revenue positive approach. I mean, we've been partying hard with fossil fuels for the last 50 to 100 years, and basically the party's over. And the next generation is going to be the one suffering the cost of this. So we all need to feel some pain, which is why we're not advocating for everybody going, oh, it's all nice, everybody's going to net out with the sales tax, you know, none of us are going to feel any pain. I think we need to recognize there's some pain to be felt here. And a revenue positive approach will allow us to invest in the kind of things that you're asking about, which is how do we put in place a water infrastructure system that we're going to be able to rely on for the next 30, 50, 100 years. This isn't my generation's issue, this is my kids and their kids, and your children and grandchildren, and we really have to be forward thinking.
We'll take one more question and then we're going to wrap it up.
Burr has the question.
I'm trying to figure out how we can make this subject more exciting. So I just wanted to ask you to close on what makes you excited about this. And I'm just to give you an example from my own work is I was looking at a railroad industry magazine the other day, and the railroads, of course, are making a lot of money hauling coal, and they're actually doing research and development right now on turning coal cars into water cars so they can start a new business of hauling water to the areas of the country that are having big water shortage problems. I just wanted to, if some other ideas of exciting things that are happening.
Okay, I'm going to give you 30 seconds.
Okay, here's what makes me really excited about this, is that planet health is people health, and that as we continue to solve these problems, we move to cleaner energy, we will end up eliminating pollution, and people actually will be healthier. We'll have lower rates of asthma and lower pulmonary issues for people in our state. That makes me excited because we're gonna have healthier kids that can go to school. We'll have parents that won't have to miss work to take care of their kids who are having asthma attacks, and it's gonna really reduce costs in our healthcare system. So that really thrills me.
That was a good line. This is often a conversation about constraints. I think the thing that excites me is the opportunity side of it. Autonomous cars, low-cost renewables, windmills and solar on your roof. I mean, this is a problem that's going to have hundreds of solutions that are all going to emerge over the next couple of years.
Oh.
I'm sorry, they told me to pull the mic, so here we go. Thank you to everybody that was here, part of our panel.
Nicely done. So in closing, I was delighted to read yesterday that European Union lawmakers endorsed the Paris climate change. Did anybody else see that in the news? I think that's a significant milestone because that means an entire continent now has pledged to pursue these climate-friendly targets. My call to action then for us this week is let's take a deep breath and invest some time to really understand this initiative and the issues that are involved. Today is just a start, but it's so important. The future of our climate really impacts all of us and future generations, and some of the decisions we take in this election season have a long-standing impact. So let's study up and let's determine which way we want to go on this initiative, but let's do vote. Our election season programming continues. In 2 weeks, on the 19th of October, we're going to tackle another one of the ballot initiatives. We're going to look at Sound Transit 3 and look at the pros and cons of that big initiative. And then next week, October 12th, we're back here at the Westin for another big program. We're going to be welcoming the Seattle Police Chief, Kathleen O'Toole, will be our main speaker. And we're also going to have a whistle-stop visit by Governor Jay Inslee. So I'll be ringing the bell at 12:20 to get us started. And just for help in terms of our space planning and our meal count, how many people are planning to come next week? I like it. How many people think they might bring a guest? Okay, so it sounds like our room, just as it's set up, will work. That's great. Well, thank you everyone for being here today. We're adjourned until 12:20 here at the Westin next Wednesday.